Right. Well, we didn't fix enough things in 2008. We basically allowed an economy that was becoming increasingly unequal to grow more and more so over time. And what that meant is you had about half the population of the planet Earth staying on or very close to poverty, one crisis away from falling back. And what's happened is we've hit that crisis.
And so what would you say is the biggest reason for the number being so high?
Well, because you have a lot of people who literally are one healthcare incident or one loss of a job or one rule by the government in their context that they can no longer work or they can't get unemployment benefits. They're that risk away from moving into poverty. And we've seen all of those things happen. The thing that's particular about this crisis is that it's both a health crisis and an economic crisis in one.
And we know that your report cites 3 regions that are the most at risk. Why are those regions at risk more than others?
So we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Africa, and the Middle East. It's a blend of things. One, you've got large pockets of population concentration in many urban centers. You've got conflict and not strong enough governance, particularly in the Middle East. You've got some contexts that are very much conflict affected. And you've also got economies that were not thriving before the crisis happened in inclusive ways, meaning that everybody in the country was benefiting from the growth that was happening. So it's a combination of factors, but those are the 3 particularly susceptible regions.
Now, the report also states that when all this is over, about half the world's population may be living in poverty. So what can governments do then to really try and stem that tide or support their populations?
Well, they can do 3 things immediately. They can cancel the debts of the countries that are now facing crisis. There are 45 countries who are paying 4 times the amount in debt servicing than they have in healthcare payments by their governments. What the IMF and the G20 countries are talking about now is suspending their debts. They're talking about that this week. That's a good start, but it's not good enough. We need them to cancel the debt payments this year so that they don't accrue next year and put them into further poverty. That's one. Secondly, the IMF needs to create an international reserve that countries can draw down on to get them through the crisis. That they're called special drawing rights. The IMF can do this. It's made more money in just its gold reserves than all of the debt requirements of poor countries since the crisis started. The third thing we're going to need to see is foreign aid by all of the richer countries of the world to help the economies and the health systems of these countries make it through the crisis.
Now, obviously, this was an unforeseen pandemic. So then what does this mean then? A lot of countries had all gotten on board with the UN Sustainable Development Goals regarding poverty. What happens to that now?
Well, I think right now we're in a moment of triage and emergency relief. We've got to stabilize the global economy. We've got to help countries to stop losing people into poverty with immediate actions. The ambitions of the Sustainable Development Goals are still the right ones, but we've got to understand that what we've just been through is going to reset what our challenges are. And if we're going to get to the Sustainable Development Goals, it's going to need a level of global leadership and multilateral cooperation that, frankly, we haven't seen since the Sustainable Development Goals were initiated at the end of the last millennium.
So as you look at different leadership around the world, then which governments are doing the best in terms of not just managing it, but really bringing down poverty rates?
Well, Oxfam isn't going to get into saying which ones are the worst and which are the best. We can tell you that none are doing enough. We have seen our own government here in the United States is not doing enough in terms of pushing for this international reserve, the special drawing rights. No country is giving enough in aid. We're trying to get countries to at least give 0.7 of their GDP in aid. There are only a handful that are doing that, but that's not going to be enough for this crisis. We need $500 billion in aid and at least $160 billion just to get the healthcare systems of the poorest countries to have enough. So we're calling on all governments to show greater leadership in tackling this as a global crisis.
Now, there have been a lot of accolades given to China and the CPC for what it's done to lift millions of Chinese out of poverty over the last 40 years or so. Will the model that China has used be able to be replicated after the virus ends, though?
I think, we're going to need the best of ideas from everywhere. If China has done things that are effective in both fighting the virus and in lifting its economy and in supporting other countries, those ideas need to be championed. Just as we hope China will look to the successes of other countries where they've had economic successes either within the country or as supporters. What we really need here is a level of global international cooperation amongst the rich nations to address this crisis collectively.